In a quiet, dimly lit room, Dona Inés prepared for what she hoped would be a joyful birthday celebration. The anticipation of seeing her beloved children brought a bittersweet smile to her face. With the aroma of her favorite cake filling the air and presents neatly wrapped, Inés sat by the window, eagerly waiting. As the clock ticked away, however, her hope turned to heartache. Her children, wrapped up in their busy lives, forgot her special day, leaving her alone with only memories and unanswered phone calls. But as the night wore on, a glimmer of unexpected joy arrived in the form of her niece, Laura, who brought with her a box of cupcakes and a warm smile. Their shared moments of laughter and comfort revealed a different perspective on family and sacrifice. Inés, hurt yet inspired, decided it was time for a bold change. Her plan to fake her death would set in motion a series of revelations for her children, challenging them to rediscover the true meaning of family. Months later, Inés' dramatic reappearance would force her children to confront their estrangement and the depth of her sacrifices. The emotional reunion marked the beginning of a new chapter, driven by lessons learned through pain and transformation. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. On the day of Dona Inés' birthday, her home echoed with an eerie stillness as not a single guest arrived to celebrate with her. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the lively gathering she had once known. Months later, her children Carlos, the accomplished lawyer, Gabriela, the ever-busy socialite, and Martin, the driven businessman, would experience a profound shock when they gathered to hear the reading of her will, expecting the usual words of affection and legacy but encountering something far different. Inés stood before the mirror, her reflection revealing a face marked by the relentless passage of time, yet still carrying a quiet dignity. As she gently placed the final pin in her silver-streaked hair, her hands, though trembling slightly from age, moved with a practiced grace. The room around her was a sanctuary of memories, its walls adorned with photographs that told the story of a life steeped in love, sacrifice, and resilience. She lingered for a moment, her gaze falling upon the images of her 3 children. Each picture captured a different chapter of their lives, and as she looked at them, Carlos in his courtroom robes, Gabriela dazzling at a gala, Martin standing proudly before his business, her heart swelled with a bittersweet pride. She had raised them alone, guiding them through life's challenges after her husband's untimely death. The memories weighed heavily on her, a mix of pride and sorrow filling her chest as she thought of the bond they once shared. With a heavy sigh, Inés made her way to the kitchen, where the comforting aroma of freshly baked cake, her children's favorite, wafted through the air, filling the room with a warmth that belied her growing sense of loneliness. The dining table was set for a celebration, adorned with 3 brightly wrapped gifts intended for her grandchildren. Inés lovingly ran her fingers over the smooth, shiny paper, imagining the joy on their little faces as they tore open the presents. Suddenly, the sharp ring of the telephone pierced the quiet, jolting her from her thoughts. Her heart leaped with hope, her pulse quickening with the possibility that it could be one of her children reaching out. Perhaps Carlos calling from his office or Gabriela dialing in from Paris. She hurried to answer, nearly stumbling in her haste. "Hello," she greeted, her voice trembling with anticipation, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, distant, and cold. "Mrs. Inés, I'm just confirming your medical appointment for next week." The word struck her like a blow, and the smile that had momentarily brightened her face slowly faded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hollow as she hung up the phone. Inés returned to her favorite armchair, her eyes drifting to the wall clock. The minutes crawled by, each second a tiny dagger of doubt stabbing at her heart. Could they have forgotten? No, she reassured herself. They would surely arrive any moment now, arms full of surprises and smiles. But as the clock struck 7 p.m., its chime echoing through the empty room, the realization began to set in. The table, once filled with hope and anticipation, now seemed to mock her with its untouched cake and unclaimed gifts. She clutched the birthday card she had written to herself, a small, tragic comfort in the absence of any real gestures of love. "Happy birthday," Mom it read in her shaky handwriting, the irony of it slicing through her like a knife. A tear slipped down her cheek, the first of many as the reality of her situation began to suffocate her. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional beep of her phone messages from acquaintances and a few neighbors, but nothing from the children she had devoted her life to. The pain became too much to bear. Struggling to her feet, Inés made her way to the window, where she stood watching as the streetlights flickered on one by one. Outside, life continued, as if unaware of the old woman's heartbreak. Families gathered for dinner, laughter floated up from the nearby park, and the world seemed to move on, indifferent to her solitude. Desperate for any connection, she picked up the photo album she had set aside, planning to reminisce with her children. She turned its pages slowly, each image a painful reminder of happier times: Carlos in his graduation gown, Gabriella's first runway show, Martin celebrating his first big business success. Her heart ached with longing for the days when they would run to her, eager to share their triumphs. Where had those children gone? The phone rang again, and with a flicker of hope, Ines reached for it, her heart pounding in her chest. "Carlos? Gabriella?" "Martin," she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. But it was only a telemarketer offering a cable service promotion in a dull, mechanical tone. The weight of reality crashed down on her, crushing the last vestiges of her hope. The tears she had tried to hold back now flowed freely, her frail body shaking with sobs as she realized the painful truth: her children had forgotten her, abandoned her on the one day she had hoped to feel their love. Hours passed in tearful silence until finally a faint knock at the door stirred her from her sorrow. Inez's heart fluttered with a fragile hope, mingled with fear, as she slowly made her way to the door. When she opened it, she found Laura, her niece, standing there with a small box of cupcakes and a warm smile. "Happy birthday, Aunt Inez," Laura said gently, stepping inside. The gesture, though small, was a balm to Inez's wounded heart. As they sat together in the kitchen, sharing coffee and quiet conversation, Inez recounted the day's bitter disappointment, her voice heavy with sorrow. Laura listened with compassionate eyes, her presence a reminder that while her children had failed her, she was not entirely alone. Yet the absence of those who mattered most cast a shadow over the evening, leaving Inez with a mix of gratitude and heartache as she struggled to find solace amid her profound loneliness. Inez's hands trembled as she clutched the coffee cup, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand, Laura," she said, her heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. "How could they forget me?" Laura gently took her aunt's frail hand, her touch warm and comforting. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions, but Laura's kindness broke through the oppressive quiet. As they spoke, it became painfully clear that Inez's children harbored disdain for their mother, looking down on her for humble beginnings. Laura's voice was tinged with sadness as she explained, "Your cousins, they've lost sight of what truly matters, Aunt Inez. They're so wrapped up in their own lives that they've forgotten the importance of family." Inez nodded slowly, the realization settling in like a cold weight in her chest. She looked at Laura with newfound clarity, recalling how her children had often dismissed her, their eyes filled with disdain for the life she had lived, a life they deemed too modest for the status they aspired to. The night dragged on, but Inez found solace in sharing stories from her youth with Laura, her laughter ringing out for the first time all day. Laura's presence, like a warm embrace, had transformed what had been a day of sorrow into something bearable. As Laura prepared to leave, Inez stood at the door, watching her niece fade into the night. A fire had been lit within her, a determination she hadn't felt in years. The day had opened her eyes, revealing truths she could no longer ignore. As she closed the door behind Laura, Inez knew that things could not remain as they were. The time for change had arrived, and she would ensure it happened. Inez sank back into her armchair, but the comfort it once provided had vanished. Memories flooded her mind, unyielding and relentless. She saw Carlos, her eldest, on the day he received his law degree. How proud she had been, even though the journey to that moment had been paved with her sacrifices: long hours of work, missed meals, and sleepless nights, all to afford the education that now seemed to mean nothing to him. Gabriella, her radiant and driven daughter, once the light of her life, is now a distant figure, lost in the world of social elites. Inez remembered the nights spent sewing dresses for Gabriella's early fashion shows, the excitement in her daughter's eyes slowly replaced by a cold detachment as the years went by. Calls from Gabriella became scarce as impersonal bank transfers took their place, a transaction, not a connection. And then there was Martin, her youngest, always so determined, so full of ambition. She had mortgaged her home to give him the seed money for his first business venture. It had paid off financially, but the emotional cost was far greater. With each success, Martin seemed to drift further away, the distance between them growing with every dollar he earned. Inez's life had been a tapestry of sacrifices, her every decision made with her children's futures in mind. She had given up birthdays, vacations, and her dreams so they could thrive. The family inheritance, built over generations, had been funneled into their luxurious lifestyles, leaving Inez with little more than memories and a deep, aching loneliness. She forced herself to her feet, moving slowly to the shelf where the family photo albums were stored. With trembling hands, she opened one, the pages filled with images of a time when her children's smiles were genuine, their laughter pure. But as the years passed, those innocent faces had hardened, replaced by expressions of calculation and indifference. One photo caught her eye: the last Christmas they had spent together 5 years ago. Carlos, impatiently checking his watch. Gabriela, engrossed in her phone. Martin, more interested in the gifts than in the presence of family. Something within Inés shifted, and a breaking point was reached. The sadness in her eyes was replaced by a steely resolve. She closed the album with a sharp snap, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "This has to change," she whispered to herself, her voice laced with newfound strength. "And I'll make sure it does." The twilight in the living room wrapped around Inés and Laura like a shroud of secrecy. Inés' voice was steady, her determination palpable as she outlined her bold plan to Laura. The younger woman listened intently, though doubt flickered in her eyes. But her loyalty to her aunt outweighed her concerns, and she nodded, ready to support Inés in whatever came next. The old woman's mind was made up. She would no longer be a footnote in her children's lives. The change she envisioned was not just for herself, but a lesson to those who had forgotten the true meaning of family. "I'm going to fake my death," Laura Inés declared, her voice steady and resolute. Laura froze, trying to grasp the gravity of what her aunt just proposed. "But Aunt, isn't that too extreme?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. Inés shook her head, her determination unwavering. "They've forgotten the value of family and the meaning of unconditional love. They need a lesson that will shake them to their core, one they can't ignore." With that decision made, the two of them began working on a plan. Inés dictated while Laura carefully took notes, outlining a new will that would serve as both a test and a lesson for her children. Each task was laden with meaning, designed to teach them the values they had long forgotten. "Carlos will work as a janitor in a nursing home," Inés said, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe then he'll rediscover the humility he once had," she continued. "Gabriela will live on minimum wage for a month. It's time for her to see life outside her bubble of luxury." When it came to Martin, Inés paused, her voice faltering slightly. "Martin will care for children in an orphanage. He needs to remember what it means to love selflessly." As the night wore on, their plans solidified. Laura watched her aunt with a mix of admiration and worry. "Are you sure about this, Aunt? Once we go down this path, there's no turning back." Inés nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "It's necessary, Laura. Sometimes the only way to teach is through drastic action." The first light of dawn crept through the windows, illuminating the room where a radically new chapter in their family history was being written. Inés knew the path she was choosing was risky and could lead to unpredictable outcomes. Yet she believed deeply that it was the only way to awaken her children to what truly mattered. Over the next few months, Inés' plan began to unfold. She meticulously prepared every detail: a believable obituary, a small, solemn ceremony. With Laura's help, the charade was carried out with tragic precision, all while keeping the true purpose hidden. Inés watched from a distance as her children gathered to bid their final farewell. Carlos, distracted by his relentless work schedule, Gabriela, jetting in from Paris with little time to spare, and Martin, taking a brief hiatus from his intense business ventures. Inés observed them from the shadows, her heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and hope. Each of her children grappled with guilt and regret, their emotions laid bare by the supposed loss of their mother. What Inés had not anticipated was the depth of their reactions, not just grief, but a profound realization of the estrangement that had grown between them. This was not a process of immediate transformation, but a slow, grueling journey of introspection and self-awareness. In time, Inés saw the changes she had hoped for begin to take root. Carlos, once driven solely by ambition, began volunteering at the nursing home. Gabriela, accustomed to a life of luxury, struggled but ultimately adapted to living on a modest income, gaining empathy for those less fortunate. Martin, who had always been focused on success, found his heart opening as he cared for orphaned children, reconnecting with the compassion he had lost along the way. Throughout this period, Inés watched from afar, her emotions a tumultuous mix of pride and sadness. The children she had once known were reemerging, their hearts softened by the challenges she had placed before them. Yet she remained hidden, allowing them the space to grow and change without her influence. Finally, the day came when Inés decided it was time to reveal the truth. She and Laura planned the moment carefully, understanding the emotional storm that was about to be unleashed. When Inés appeared before her children, their shock was palpable. their emotions raw and unfiltered. The revelation of her deception ignited a firestorm of anger, confusion, and eventually painful apologies. The confrontation was intense, forcing each of them to confront not only the reality of their mother's actions, but the truth of their behavior. The reunion that followed was not without its challenges, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Inez had succeeded in her goal. Her children were humbled, transformed by the trials they had endured. Together, they began the slow work of rebuilding their relationships, guided by the lessons learned through their shared ordeal. The house that had once echoed with silence and solitude now brimmed with the sounds of healing and reconciliation. Inez, her heart finally at peace, watched as her family came together to mend the bonds that had been strained for so long. Her dramatic gesture, once a radical and risky gamble, had become a powerful testament to the enduring strength of family, the importance of love, and the possibility of redemption even after the most difficult trials. Navigating the narrow streets with determination, Martin pushed through the dense woods, calling out Pedrito's name until his voice was nothing but a painful rasp. Word of the situation rapidly spread across the small town, causing a wave of concern and urgency. Upon hearing the news, Carlos and Gabriela immediately abandoned their tasks, driven by a deep sense of dread. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the three siblings found themselves united by a single purpose: finding Pedrito. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the landscape, an anguished cry pierced the stillness. "He's here," Martin's voice echoed with a mixture of desperation and relief. Pedrito had fallen into a deep ditch, his small frame trembling with fear, yet miraculously unharmed. Without a moment's hesitation, Martin hurled himself down the slippery incline, disregarding the sharp pain of rocks and thorns tearing at his skin. His only thought was of the frightened boy below. Reaching Pedrito, Martin gently lifted him into his arms, his heart pounding with both relief and fear. The climb back up was arduous, each step a battle against the treacherous slope, but Martin's resolve was unwavering. "You're safe now, Pedrito," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, even as tears of relief welled up in his eyes. As they finally reached the surface, caked in mud and overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, they were met with a wave of applause and embraces from the gathered townsfolk. Carlos and Gabriela rushed to them, their faces etched with gratitude and a newfound respect for their brother. That evening, the three siblings sat together in silence, sharing a simple meal at the inn. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them. For years, they had been estranged, each harboring their pain and resentment. But now, something had shifted. The walls they had built around themselves were beginning to crumble. Martin stared at his trembling hands, still feeling the lingering fear that had gripped him earlier, a fear that transcended material concerns and touched something far deeper. "Martin, you did something extraordinary today," Carlos finally said, breaking the silence that had settled over them. His voice was filled with a sincerity that had long been absent. "Mom would be proud." Gabriela, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, nodded in agreement. "We all are," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, they all felt the weight of years of indifference and selfishness lift slightly, revealing the true value of the bond. They shared a bond rooted in love, sacrifice, and the realization that they needed each other more than they had ever admitted. The next day, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread filled the small cafe where Gabriela worked. Her once delicate hands, now roughened by labor, moved with practiced ease as she cleaned tables and served customers. As she wiped down a table, she overheard two women discussing the upcoming festival in Roble Viejo, a celebration that hadn't taken place since before she had left the town. "Everyone's so excited," one woman said with a smile. "It sounds like it's going to be something truly special this year." Gabriela couldn't help but be intrigued. After all these years, the idea of reviving such a cherished tradition seemed both surreal and strangely appealing. Later that day, Gabriela shared the news with Carlos as he finished up his shift at the nursing home. His face brightened as she recounted the conversation, the excitement in her voice contagious. "What do you think, Carlos?" she asked, her eyes shining with anticipation. Carlos paused, the idea taking root in his mind. "It could be a good opportunity," he replied thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time we reconnected with the town and with each other differently." That evening, the siblings discussed the festival over dinner. At first, Martin appeared indifferent, but as the conversation unfolded, the idea of participating began to appeal to him. "We could help organize it," he suggested, surprising himself. "It might be a way for us to become part of the community again." Determined to follow through, the three of them decided to attend the next town meeting, where festival preparations were already underway. When they arrived, the town hall was abuzz with activity, and they spotted Laura among the crowd, her usual stern demeanor softened by the enthusiasm around her. Seeing her cousins enter, Laura's expression shifted to one of surprise and caution. "What brings you here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. "We want to help," Carlos answered simply. Laura hesitated, her emotions swirling as she looked at them. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "We want to," Gabriela insisted gently. "We need to." As the festival preparations continued, the siblings found themselves more and more involved, contributing to every aspect, from decorations to the main event of play that would celebrate the town's heritage. For the first time in years, they felt connected to something greater than themselves. The experience brought them closer, helping them rediscover the strength of their familial bond. Meanwhile, Laura wrestled with her feelings. Seeing the positive changes in her cousin stirred a mix of emotions within her. The plan she had been so confident in now seemed cruel and unnecessary. One day, unable to bear the guilt any longer, Laura approached Carlos as he was hanging lanterns with Pedrito's help. "Carlos, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Carlos turned to her, concern etched on his face. "What's on your mind, Laura?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I haven't been entirely honest with you. None of this happened by chance. It was all part of a plan, Aunt Inez's plan." As Laura revealed the truth, the air between them grew heavy with tension. Carlos listened in stunned silence, his emotions swirling from confusion to anger, and finally to deep sorrow. "So all of this has been a lie?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "No," Laura replied earnestly, tears streaming down her face. "The experiences you've had, the people you've met, those are real. But it all began with deception. And for that, I am truly sorry." Carlos stood there, grappling with the weight of her words. The revelation was painful, but deep down, he knew that the transformation he and his siblings had undergone was genuine. The anger that had flared up inside him began to subside, leaving behind a profound sadness and a sense of loss. "I need time to process this," he said quietly before walking away, his steps heavy with the burden of this new truth. In the days leading up to the festival, a palpable tension hung between the siblings and Laura. They continued to help with the preparations, but an invisible barrier had formed, built from unspoken words and conflicting emotions. On the night of the festival, Roble Viejo came alive with music, laughter, and the mouth-watering scent of food. The town square was filled with joyful celebration as the residents reveled in the return of a long-lost tradition. Yet, amidst the festivities, Carlos, Gabriela, and Martin felt like outsiders, struggling to find their place in a community that had once been theirs but now seemed distant and unfamiliar. "For the charity fair, we could set up the stalls in the plaza," Gabriela suggested, her eyes alight with enthusiasm. "Every cent we raise will go towards renovating the primary school, giving the children a better place to learn." Meanwhile, across town at the orphanage, Martin knelt in the elder, guiding small hands through the process of planting vegetables. His fingers, once accustomed only to the smooth surfaces of legal papers and keyboards, were now stained with earth. "Just like you need space to grow, so does this carrot," Pedrito encouraged a little one struggling to dig into the stubborn soil. As the day unfolded, the impact of their actions began to ripple through the town, weaving a new thread of unity. Conversations sparked, stories were shared, and the town rediscovered a sense of community that had been buried under the weight of time. At the plaza, a group of teenagers approached Carlos, their eyes wide with inspiration drawn from his efforts. "We want to help," a young girl said earnestly. "What can we do to make a difference?" In the cozy cafe, merchants moved by Gabriela's passion began to offer more than was asked of them. "I'll donate all the flowers for the decorations," the florist volunteered. "And my brother can take care of the music," another added with a smile. Over at the orphanage, whispers of change reached potential adoptive parents, who began to visit with hopeful hearts. Martin welcomed them warmly, sharing his journey and gently urging them to consider adoption as a path to building their families. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three siblings had unwittingly set into motion a transformation that reached far beyond their own lives. The town, once skeptical and distant, now looked upon them with a mixture of awe and gratitude. That evening, when they gathered for dinner at the inn, there was a quiet but palpable shift in the air, an awakening of purpose that none of them had ever known before. "You know," Martin began, breaking the comfortable silence, "I think I finally understand what Mom was always trying to teach us." Carlos and Gabriela exchanged glances, their expressions tinged with both nostalgia and a new sense of clarity. "I wish you were here to see this," Gabriela murmured, her voice soft, still wrestling with the doubts she harbored about their mother's true intentions. What none of them realized was that Inez, hidden in the shadows outside the inn, had been watching. Tears glistened in her eyes, her heart torn between overwhelming pride and the gnawing guilt that she could no longer ignore. With a heavy sigh, she turned and walked away, knowing that the time for truth was drawing near. As the evening settled over Roble Viejo, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and purple, Laura wandered through the cobblestone streets, her thoughts in turmoil. She had spent the day observing her cousins, marveling at the changes she saw in them, but the secret she carried was becoming an unbearable weight on her soul. She stopped in front of the cafe, gazing through the window at Gabriela. The woman who had once been the epitome of frivolity now moved with a grace and kindness that Laura had never seen before. So lost was she in her thoughts that she didn't notice Carlos approaching until he spoke. "Laura," he said softly. Startled, she turned to face him. "Carlos," she replied, struggling to keep her composure. "How are you?" "You. I think I should be asking you that," Carlos responded, his gaze steady and filled with an unreadable mix of emotions. "I know things have been complicated, but I've been thinking a lot lately." "About what?" Laura whispered, her heart pounding. "About us, about Mom, and the truth," Carlos said, his eyes searching hers for answers. Laura felt a lump rise in her throat. "Carlos, I need to know everything," Carlos interrupted, though his tone was gentle. "Why did you do it? Why did you bring us back here?" Laura took a deep breath, trying to steady the tumult inside her. "It was meant to be a test," she began, "a way to make you see the value of what you had lost. I wanted you to find yourselves again, to reconnect with the town, with each other, but I never intended for it to go this far." Carlos listened, his face a battlefield of emotions, and now he asked quietly. "Now I see that maybe I pushed too hard," Laura confessed, tears welling up in her eyes. "I see the changes in you, and I'm so proud of what you've done, but I know that the way I went about it was wrong." Carlos looked at her, his anger tempered by the understanding beginning to bloom. "It's too late for apologies," he said softly, "but maybe there's still a chance for us to move forward." Laura nodded, tears spilling over as she whispered, "I hope so, Carlos. I do." As we wrap up this chapter, we've seen how small acts of kindness and a renewed sense of purpose can transform not just individuals but entire communities. The journey of Gabriela, Martin, and Carlos is a powerful reminder of the impact we can have when we step outside our comfort zones and reconnect with what truly matters. What have you learned from their story so far? We'd love to hear from you. Share one thing you've learned and how you plan to bring it into practice in your own life in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.